Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Erin Hollis, Associate Director at the MIT Alumni Association. Thank you for joining today's program, Strategic Relationships at Work, Creating Your Circle of Mentors and Peers. As a reminder, our webinar is being broadcast live. I encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A feature found on your toolbar. For listeners joining via YouTube, you may add your questions to the comments field. You can also tweet your comments and questions using hashtag #MITBetterWorld. It is my great pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Kathy Cram, R.C. Shipley Professor in Management Emerita at Boston University. Dr. Cram's primary interests are in the areas of leadership development, relational learning, mentoring, coaching, developmental networks, and change process in organizations. In addition to her book, Mentoring at Work, she has published in a wide range of journals and handbooks. Dr. Cram regularly consults with organizations to create developmental cultures and practices that foster effective mentoring and coaching for individuals at every career stage. She is a principal in Innovative Communities in the Workplace and is a founding member of the Center for Research on Emotional Intelligence in Organizations. Currently, she is completing a book on peer coaching at work, principles and practices, with doctors Polly Parker, Douglas Tim Hall, and Eileen Wasserman. She is also collaborating with 5 colleagues on a large study of the transition into retirement, led by Teresa Amable at Harvard Business School. With that, Kathy, I will turn things over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Erin. Let me just get this going here. Good morning. Actually, it's just noon now, and I'm delighted to be here with all of you. I am very interested in sharing some of what I've learned over the past 40 years about the nature of mentoring and how important it is as a developmental tool for advancing your career. I'm assuming many of you tuned in today because you are interested in knowing how mentoring might serve you as you move forward in your own development. So let me tell you the questions that I hope to answer today. First of all, what does mentoring look like in today's global, fast-changing, diverse, and volatile context? We've actually been studying mentoring for almost 40 years now, and the world looked very different at that point in time. Most companies were not yet global. There was a kind of stability and very stable hierarchy that people worked in. And so it was kind of easy to identify your mentor and to stick with your mentor. But today, things are changing so quickly that it doesn't really work that way. I'm going to also introduce to you the idea of how important it is to have your own developmental network, which is basically a small group of advisors that you enlist in your own development. It may include a traditional mentor, and it may include a number of other people as well. So before the end of our time together, I'm going to leave you with some specific steps you can take to build your own effective personal board of advisors. So let's look at the traditional definition of a mentor, which we established early on in research in the mid to late 70s. An individual higher up in an organization or profession who provides developmental support, meaning coaching, guidance, sponsorship, counseling, and even friendship to a protege. And the picture there is meant to remind us all that in the late 70s, early 80s, most of the mentors were white males. And we will be talking a little bit later about the dynamics of diversity and how that shapes what mentoring looks like in today's organizations. There's been a great deal of research, as I mentioned, and I just want to summarize what some of the key points are. First of all, the term mentoring actually goes way back to Greek mythology, where in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus asked Mentor to take care of his son Telemachus when Odysseus was sent off to fight in the Trojan War. Mentor was perceived as someone who would guide, nurture, take care of, and instill wisdom to Telemachus. And that was the origin of the term. It also is part of Greek mythology that Athena was another Greek goddess who also took over Mentor's role and provided the more nurturing, compassionate, and perhaps feminine parts of the mentoring role. There's been a lot of research on networking. I'm sure many of you know the importance of networking. Well, what that has led us to see is that mentoring does not necessarily only occur in your immediate place of work. It can be all over the world. You might connect with people who could provide developmental support. So that led us actually to the idea of thinking about a small developmental network where you can really position yourself to get the support and guidance that you need. And then there is the point I mentioned about diversity and intersectionality and how every relationship that you might encounter is unique to the extent that each of the partners brings certain background and historical experiences which shape how you enter into and negotiate a mentoring relationship. And then finally, given the pace of change and the use of technology and globalization, relationships have come to take many different forms and can include online remote relationships all the way to face-to-face and group relationships. The key findings from these 30 years of research that I want you to remember are these. That in general, informal relationships are much more effective than those that are formally assigned. And if you want to know more about that you can certainly ask about that in the follow-up. The second important finding is that mentoring relationships are complex and they require certain skills, skills at listening, skills at building trust, skills at self-disclosure, skills at empathizing with another person. And many times these relationships don't get off the ground or fail to provide the kind of support that people are looking for because relational skills are not well developed. The last point I want to make is the most recent research in the last 10 years indicates that the best mentoring relationships involve two people who are both learning as a result of the connection. It used to be, mentoring used to be defined as a one-way learning relationship, which was focused entirely on the junior person's learning and development. And today we know that if the mentor is also learning, the commitment, the depth, the quality of the relationship will be much greater. So I think we're going to have a polling question now. Is that correct, Erin? Here we go. Okay. You can answer this question. Okay. Well, here's what I see. First of all, that there's a pretty good percentage in the room today who have never had mentors, about 37%. And there are almost 50% who have had more than one, but less than five. So what I want to invite you to do, those of you who have experienced mentoring, is to call into your mind those relationships right now as I present to you what we've learned about mentoring. And for those of you who have not had mentoring relationships, you may find that when I share more about it, you will realize that, in fact, maybe someone did serve as a mentor and you just didn't acknowledge it that way. Okay, so let's go on then. What we learned from the research is that mentoring actually provides 3 types of support. First of all is what we call career support, things that a developer might do to coach you, to help you with develop technical skills, who might give you challenging assignments, and who can sponsor you for positions of greater responsibility. And a lot of organizational mentors, people who work in your own organization, are able to provide these functions. The second type of functions are called psychosocial support. And these are more based on the quality of the interpersonal relationship. It involves a lot of emotional support, counseling, unconditional regard, positive regard. And it's a very important part of mentoring. Sometimes we see mentoring that provides only career support, and that does not necessarily feel very good to the mentee or the protege. They may be getting opportunities to learn skills. They may be given opportunities to be present at important meetings. But if they're not getting the encouragement and positive and personal feedback that they need, they may feel kind of isolated or uncertain as to whether what they're doing is really valued by the organization. The third type of support that I want to mention is role modeling. And this was discovered as a separate function not too long ago, because it's only in the highest quality mentoring relationship that individuals feel inspired, inspired to be more than they are, inspired to emulate their mentors. So it can be someone who's not just a sponsor, not just opening doors, but also living a life that you want to embrace yourself. So combined, these 3 types of support are very important. What I am going to argue to you in a couple of minutes is that we don't necessarily get all of these sources of support in one relationship. And that's why the idea of a personal board of advisors or a developmental network is so critical to making mentoring a regular part of your life. Okay, so I'm just quickly going to summarize here what the benefits are of these developmental relationships. And if I could redefine it, it's a relationship that is the primary purpose of the relationship is learning, and that while the primary purpose is usually focused on the less experienced person, in the highest quality relationships, mentors benefit considerably as well. So here you see what's in it for mentees, what's in it for mentors, and then finally, what's in it for organizations. You can see that mentoring can really have a big effect on performance, retention, succession planning. It's really a critical tool for organizations, not just for individuals. Okay, so now I want to shift on, now that we have a common understanding of what I mean by mentoring. My colleague Monica Higgins and I wrote a piece a while back where we proposed that the traditional mentoring arrangement doesn't work anymore, that a single senior colleague can't possibly keep up with all the changes, and people should create a small group of people who provide regular advice and support. And this is one way you might think about it, with you in the center, and those purple people on the outside are people that you enlist who may be senior mentors, who may be peers, who may even be less experienced people than you, or people outside your organization, and who may even be part of your family or your community. This is what we call a network approach. The traditional mentoring approach was to look inside your organization, up the hierarchy, find a relationship that would help you accomplish your personal and professional goals. The new approach is that you look to people not only senior to you, but at your level, below your level, not only inside your organization, but outside your organization and even outside your profession. And that these relationships can also extend to group relationships, not just to one-on-one dyadic relationships. So as you think about the possibility of your own developmental network, and I suspect a number of you already have this going on in your careers, but you just haven't labeled it as such. If you think about the people around you and who may be providing advice and support, consider perhaps a formally assigned mentor, leaders in your organization, industry associates, peers, people outside of work in your personal support system, and what we now call reverse mentors, who are people lower down in your organization with less experience, but who may have some very important knowledge that you desire to gain. This is a picture of what your developmental network might look like. So I thought I'd share mine with you, just so you have a feel for what it might look like. So I recently became emerita at Boston University in the School of Management faculty. And Boston University used to be a much bigger part of my developmental network than it is now. And you can see that I have several other domains where I draw support from, including my family, my community, consulting clients and colleagues at other universities. I will note to you that prior to my transitioning away from Boston University as a full-time faculty member, my developmental network looked very different and basically had Boston University and my family and friends, and not much at all in my community or my consulting arenas, a few with colleagues at other universities. So every time you or I make a change professionally or personally, it's an opportunity and an important time to assess your developmental network and consider how you may want to redesign it. What do I mean by that? I mean, actually asking yourself, given that I'm moving this way or that way in my professional or personal life, what changes do I need to make in my developmental network? Who do I want to enlist? For example, if I'm changing to a job at another firm in the same line of work, I will certainly want to focus on enlisting people at that new firm. If I'm changing industries or I want to change industries, I will want to enlist people who are in those other industries that I would like to explore. If I'm on the, if I'm about to start a family, it might behoove me to enlist other women who have successfully integrated a life with small children into their active professional lives. So there are all kinds of reasons why we need to update our developmental network. I would invite you, not now because we have such a limited time, but I would invite you to consider drawing your own current developmental network and see what it looks like for you and what you can learn from doing that. And what you would reflect upon basically is who have the people been who have taken an active interest and action to advance your career. And as I mentioned before, it could be people both inside and outside your organization, in your family, your community, a whole host of places where you might seek this kind of developmental support. After you've done that, there are some good questions to ask yourself. How many developers do you have? I would suggest to you that if you can only identify one or two people in your developmental network, and this happens when I teach, many times people can identify perhaps a boss and maybe their spouse as developers, as two people that they do get support and guidance from. And I would suggest if those are the only two you have in your network, you're probably missing out on some opportunities to learn and to connect with people who can offer further insight and support as you confront challenges along the way. How interconnected is your network? That means who in your network knows each other. And the place where this becomes important is if you're trying to advance within a given department or organization, it's really good for people in your network to know each other because they can strategize among themselves how to create opportunities for you whose interests they share. The tie strength, how close are your connections? And we're going to ask another polling question soon to get at that. And how many types of support do you need? Or do you have? I'm sorry. Let me just go back to that for a second. Okay. How many types of support do your developers provide? So if you notice that your relationships provide all the career support, but none of the psychosocial support, then you're probably missing out on something that could really be helpful to you. Or perhaps you don't have any mentors or developers who serve as role models for you. You may want to think about who out there could be an effective role model to you, and how might you develop some kind of connection with that person. So you notice that what I'm suggesting here is that you can analyze your current network, and then you can decide whether it's time to take some action to foster new relationships or to deepen existing relationships. What we know is relationships really fall on a continuum from highly transformative ones that inspire and really help an individual move forward with their own deepest goals and purposes, to the other extreme, which is dysfunctional, where people may feel violated, misunderstood, or betrayed. And actually, the majority of mentoring relationships usually fall in the middle range here. They have positive outcomes that lead to growth and learning, but they don't necessarily have the deep transformational effects on how one experiences themselves the way the high quality relationships do. Okay, I would suggest to you that when the relationships are high quality, that these are the outcomes that you will experience if you haven't already. Usually, experiences in these kind of developmental relationships leave people feeling energized and revitalized, more empowered, a better sense of self-worth, as having learned new knowledge and skills, and also wanting to actually have more connections. So it's a very common experience when those relationships are part of your life, and those of you who have experienced them know what I'm talking about. Okay, so again, here are some of the questions that I would like to leave you with today. What is the opportunity or leadership challenge that you're currently facing? And how is your developmental network supporting you in facing those challenges? And what new support can you get from your current developers? How can you leverage your current network to people that could be helpful to you? Okay, I want now, I believe we're going to have another polling question. Let's see if I'm right about that. Oh, we should have had it a while ago. I must have skipped over it. Erin, is it possible to get it up now or not? Oh, here we go. Okay, so at my current place of work, mentorship opportunities are not available, hardly available, somewhat available, and easily available. So it's interesting because the majority of you are in the middle, hardly available and somewhat available. And, you know, the truth is that in my observation and listening to others over the years, that mentoring tends to be perceived as scarce. And sometimes it really is, because the culture of the place is very competitive and it's hard to connect with others in a meaningful and trustworthy way. And if you're in that kind of situation, you may want to really ask yourself, one, do I want to be here in a relatively isolating and hostile environment? And two, are there places outside my immediate organization that I can look for the developmental support that I'm seeking? Those of you who, I guess the biggest percentage of you say mentoring was somewhat available. 42% of you said somewhat available. So let me begin to wrap up by telling you why this is the case and what you might do about it. So here are some of the obstacles. First of all, unclear or unrealistic expectations. If there's not good communication between two people who might form a developmental alliance, there's a very good possibility that one or the other will be disillusioned because they don't get what they expect. But it may be there was never clear communication about it. There's an awful lot of time pressure, which makes people reluctant to take time out to get to know another person, which is the way to begin this kind of developmental relationship. I remember in one of my classrooms many years ago, somebody went back to work after hearing me in an MBA class and asked his senior vice president if he would be his mentor. And the vice president was really taken aback by this request. And the next week in class, we talked about, asking someone to be your mentor is like asking someone to marry you on the first date. And instead, what we need to do is create opportunities to get to know the person, to perhaps ask for invitations, to invite the person to give feedback, or to ask the person if they would tell you how their career path unfolded over time. Another thing that we talked about already is poor interpersonal skills, and obviously there's a lot you can do about that. Difficulty managing feedback, managing differences, which I would like to tell you something about. I'm not sure how much time we'll have for it, but this is another complexity that we have to deal with. Okay, what I'm suggesting to you is, if you don't feel like you have the interpersonal skills or the relational skills, that's definitely something to work on, and there are a lot of ways to do that. I'm sure even the organizations you work with or for do that as well. Many leadership development programs offer opportunities to practice these relational skills. I want to talk for a minute about what we call second generation bias, which suggests that women and people of color are going to have a harder time, are going to face unique challenges due to not being a member of the dominant white male group in an organization. And if you are mentoring someone who's different from you along a number of different dimensions of diversity, it's really good to ask yourself the question, how are we different from each other along what dimensions of diversity? And what does that mean for our capacity to understand each other, to provide support and advice? What might the advantages be? I see a lot of advantages in cross-gender and interracial mentoring, for example. It's an advantage because both parties, if they're good listeners, they can actually learn a lot from working with someone who's different. The challenge has to do with it may be more difficult to actually create rapport and a level of trust, which allows for deep sharing. But it's something that reaps huge benefits when it's done effectively. Just as a summary to that, and we can certainly come back to it later, is the limits of role modeling, collusion and stereotypes, public scrutiny of relationships in which there's diversity. Sometimes peers think their peer is getting preferential treatment, special attention, and there's sometimes protective hesitation and defensiveness on the part of both mentor and mentee when there are gender and racial differences. And for cross-gender, there's always the issues around sexuality and intimacy, which, as we know, can create all kinds of problems in the workplace. The main response to these added complexities is to make those complexities discussable. And really, I see it as the onus being on mentors. Those of you in the audience who are mentors, you're really the ones who need to bring these issues out into the open. It's much harder for a lower power person to do that. And for everyone, I would suggest that when you have a personal board of advisors, you will have access to other developmental relationships with people who may be like you or who have experienced some of the complexities in diverse relationships that you're experiencing. I would just say, as we begin to wrap up, I would suggest that if you're in a relationship that doesn't feel good, that you do some journaling around it, and especially enlist a peer coach or another trusted third party to help you think through the relationship and what may be creating obstacles or whether it's time to move on. But certainly in reflecting on a problematic relationship, there's a great opportunity to learn. Okay, as a summary, be proactive, reach out broadly and often. I really hope as a result of today's talk, you will begin to see people differently and see opportunities for reaching out and initiating meetings with other people. Prepare for meetings. Think about what you could bring to a conversation that would help you get to know another person, to interest them in your development, or if you're on the mentor side of the equation, what you can bring to a meeting to help you learn about the other person and to figure out if and how you might be helpful. Think about when and how to share aspects of your own experience that would build trust and mutual support to the relationship, and definitely convey appreciation. I can't tell you what it means to mentors, and I would include myself here, when people come back 3 or 5 years later and say, you know, when you sat down and talked with me about such and such, that really made a big difference in my life. Because mentors don't always know it, and it's part of the satisfaction they get from being engaged in these type of developmental relationships is to know they've been helpful, and to keep in touch, and to make sure you're always asking, how can I help the other person learn as well? Okay, and then for those of you who may be in the role of mentor, wondering what you can do to enhance the quality of diverse mentoring, become aware of how you might learn from potential mentees. Take responsibility for making these identity group differences discussable. Expect and invite questioning of your views. Follow up on difficult conversations. Anticipate that the other person's developmental needs will change. And make sure you have a demographically diverse network yourself, so that you can learn how to operate in a diverse work environment. And finally, here are some of the organizational approaches to making it a more suitable culture for mentoring. And I won't go into these now. I'm happy to talk about them if you like during the question and answers. My final thoughts: we face very unique challenges in the current career context. A relational approach, building a developmental network, is essential. And you can use it from today onward to assess what you need and how to bring it into your professional and personal life as you go forward. And I thank you. And we will now be open to questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kathy. That was a lot of great content covered in a short amount of time. I want to remind everyone this presentation will be up on our YouTube channel 1 week from today. So be sure to check that out. We've gotten a lot of great questions here. I thought one that we could start with, Kathy, is the difference between, we've heard a lot of these terms throughout the presentation, mentor, advisor, and coach. Are these terms used interchangeably, or is there a difference, a distinction between them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. They are distinctive. However, in the original definition of mentoring from way back in the late 70s, sponsoring and coaching were actually included in the definition. Remember, I talked about a range of career and psychosocial functions that a mentor might provide. What has happened over the years is that we've gravitated toward the idea of developmental relationships as an umbrella term for all the different types of relationships that might exist. So you can look, and even in the book that's listed here, Strategic Relationships at Work, we define those different types. We define a sponsor as someone who's primarily focused at helping you advance up a hierarchical or career ladder, opening doors for you, creating opportunities for you. We define a coach as someone who helps you learn how to handle challenging situations at work by actually listening to you and giving you advice and posing questions to you that will help you behave more effectively in your current position. An advisor could be, it's a more limited role of someone who on a particular subject, like a particular technical methodology, could actually advise you on how to make use of it or how to learn about it. And that's the extent of their developmental support. So each role is different, and the term developmental relationship could mean any of those.
Thank you, Kathy. Next question, we often hear that women in particular are over-mentored and under-sponsored. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have heard that term. I think it was Sylvia Hewitt who wrote about that. I don't really agree with it. I think nobody can be over-mentored. It may be they're under-sponsored in the extent to which that men don't naturally sponsor women as they would men. So it's up to women to be proactive about seeking that out and letting male sponsors know that they are qualified and ambitious and want their support and advocacy. So it's a bit of more of a burden for women to make sure they get it. That's true.
Okay, thank you. You touched upon this one a little bit, but was hoping maybe you could provide some additional examples. So this alum wrote in, I'm more of an introvert and find it easier to seek relationships from a mentor from areas of interest versus where I work. What's your advice for finding more informal relationships or advisors that are similar to my background and interests?
Yeah, well, that's such a good question. And it is harder for introverts to initiate relationships with people they don't know. That's by definition. So it requires a bit of stretching and a willingness to take that risk and practice. I often encourage students to practice initiating new relationships, even with people they're not convinced they want them as mentors, but just as a way of learning how to and getting comfortable with reaching out. And then, if you have particular hobbies, to definitely participate in those, and because that is a place where you might meet people who could serve as developmental advisors or mentors to you.
Wondering if you could clarify, you used the term informal relationships, and there were some questions. Do you mean a casual relationship, or do you mean a relationship based on a special interest, such as extracurricular activities, sports, hiking, common interests? In the context of how you were discussing that earlier, can you define that for us?
Yeah, so by informal, another word I would use for that is naturally occurring. So that can happen in the workplace as well. For example, let's say you were invited to a sales meeting where there were 30 to 50 people that you didn't necessarily know. You could have the intention in mind to try to have conversations with some of the people there to find out more about their interests and their career history, with the intention of trying to start building relationships, some of which you might follow up on and some of which you might just let go. The same is true as if I'm a member of a hiking club. That I might go on a group hike, and during the course of that hike, I discover that someone in the group works in the same industry that I do. I didn't know that, and that's not why I'm in the hiking group with them. But we start talking, or we discover we're both working moms, and the stresses and strains of that experience lead us to want to continue to converse. So that's another informal relationship. Now, the reason why I say, and this has been proven empirically, informal relationships tend to work better, is because they're based on a personal chemistry, whereas formally assigned mentoring relationships are not. They're based more on usually what a third party thinks might be a good match for you. Sometimes companies will try to take into account your interests, your values, and try to match more carefully, and that certainly helps. So a lot of formal mentoring relationships do work out because there's a lot of attention given to the initial matching process, but a lot of them don't as well.
Thank you. So again, you touched upon this a little bit earlier, but not all mentoring, advising relationships are a good fit. If you find yourself in this situation, how would you personally sort of politely exit that relationship? What are some strategies there?
Yeah, that's good. It's hard to answer that specifically because I think different situations would call for different exit strategies. I can say, though, having someone to rehearse it with is a good idea. I'm very much, that's why we just wrote this book on peer coaching. I believe peer coaches, a peer that you trust, can be very helpful in thinking through, how do I exit this relationship? It may be, if you're unhappy, the other person is ready to move on too. It's possible. So it may just be a matter of saying, I think perhaps our relationship is no longer serving our purposes, and I want to thank you very much, and I'm going to move on. Or it may be simply fine, depending on how the relationship has evolved to this point, to just start investing in other relationships and gradually letting this one go. So the specifics are important, but so I can't give you more specific advice, but those are a few suggestions I would have.
This, I guess, could be considered a follow-up to that. Biggest mistakes to avoid when working with a mentor? What are the do's and the don'ts, I guess?
Yeah, those are great questions. Well, first of all, as I said before, don't ask a mentor to be your mentor the first time you meet them, but instead try to get to know the person and let them know you a bit first. I think another mistake is to assume that your mentor knows what you want and knows what you need or expect from a mentor, rather than really articulating and asking, if you think it appropriate, your mentor, can we talk about how often we're going to meet and what we're going to talk about, and actually establish an agreement about how you're going to move forward in the relationship. To make any assumptions and not test them can lead to misunderstanding. Let's see, what else is problematic? Of course, benefiting from the interactions, but not giving feedback or not expressing appreciation can be a downfall as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'll leave it at that.
And I'm sure trust also plays a big part in the relationship.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point too. And I'm speaking from the mentee's point of view, but these apply to the mentors as well. That, maintaining confidentiality that is what says what we talk about here stays between us, is very important for building and maintaining trust. Yeah.
A lot of great questions coming in here. Let me just get to our next one. Any advice for our millennials audience in particular on mentoring?
Yeah, I smiled because our older generations are asking, how can we mentor millennials effectively? So both groups are wondering how to do this, because I think we all recognize that the life experiences that millennials have had to date are quite different than those that mentors had when they were millennials or when they were young. So I think millennials need to remember that us older folks are not as used to using technology all the time. And so I know for myself, I tend to have a preference for face-to-face communication because I'm relatively new to Facebook and LinkedIn and other ways of communicating. Whereas for millennials, it might be very normal not to use the phone or face-to-face much at all. You're much more used to living via technology of all sorts. So remembering that difference is important. And I would say the same thing to mentors, that it's really knowing how your generational differences might impact your personal preferences, and then talking about them and making sure that you and your potential mentor, your potential protege, is open and willing to try some methods that may not be so familiar or comfortable. The other thing that I think millennials need to remember or could benefit from remembering is you have a lot of technical knowledge that your mentors don't have, and that your mentors could really benefit from learning from you. So the opportunity to make it a two-way mutual learning experience are really great when it involves a millennial and an older, more seasoned professional. So I would hope you would keep that in mind.
Thank you. And maybe you can speak from experience on this one. The politics around having a mentor that's, working in your company or organization in terms of confidentiality. Have you been in any situations where you've had a mentee that's worked in an organization and perhaps you felt that, in order for them to grow, it was time to look for opportunities outside the company, but is there, a conflict of interest there? I don't know if you can give any examples or strategies on how to avoid sort of those uncomfortable situations into a relationship.
Well, you know what, Erin, that's a great situation in which to remember you don't need to rely on one mentor. If I'm understanding the question correctly, if it's awkward for me to either advise you to move on, or if it's awkward for me as a mentee to say to my mentor, I'm thinking about moving on, that's the argument for having multiple developers. So you can talk to people outside your organization about sensitive matters, which may be costly to bring up inside the organization. Mm-hmm. Am I getting it the right question?
Yeah, so just knowing your audience, and I guess, again, the trust factor comes in there. And if you have a network, perhaps leaning on someone outside of your immediate network.
Yeah, but that being said, I do think that I'm thinking about my own career history, that over 35 years that I spent at Boston University, I did develop one or two really close relationships where I could confide about sensitive matters. But those were carefully developed relationships over many years. Otherwise, until you feel that there's a level of mutual trust and confidence, I think you need to test that over time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm looking at the time. We just have a few minutes left. I did want to plug quickly a new resource that's available through the MIT Alumni Association, and that is the Advisors Hub. This is a platform for alumni looking for advice from other alumni, or students looking for advice from other alumni. There's an opportunity to do mock interviewing, have someone check out your resume, have career conversations. So if you haven't signed up, I encourage you to do so on our Alumni Association website. And as a reminder, we'll be sending a survey after today's presentation. So we would love to hear your feedback. If you haven't, I know we were having some technical difficulties with registration yesterday. If you hadn't officially registered, I do encourage you to do so that you can receive the survey, and there'll be a copy of the slides on there as well for those looking for that. So Dr. Cram, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good. All right. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.